Hello students. So students, in this particular session we are going to start with a new chapter. The name of this chapter is Respiration and Energy Transfer. So basically in this chapter we are going to study everything related to respiration and how the energy transfer takes place in an organism's body. So let us start with cellular respiration. So let us understand the meaning of it first. Respiration, it is a process in which the respiratory substrate it is broken down to release energy. Okay, so if we see the definition of respiration, it is defined as a metabolic process wherein the living cell of an organism it obtains energy. Now this energy is obtained by taking in oxygen and liberating out carbon dioxide from the oxidation of a complex organic substance. So basically a complex organic substance over here is broken down to release some energy. Okay, and this energy it is in the form of ATP. Now when we speak about respiration in higher organisms like humans, there are two main parts of respiration in higher organisms. The first part is breathing. Breathing is when we take in oxygen and then we are giving out carbon dioxide, the inhaling and the exhaling process, correct? The second part is the oxygen that we take in, it reaches the cell where it is broken down to release energy. And this part where the oxygen is reaching the cell and it is broken down to release energy, this is called as the cellular respiration. So one is the external respiration that we do, that is inhaling and exhaling, and the second one is internal respiration that happens at the cellular level. Okay, and if we speak about the two main types of respiration, this we have been studying from the lower standards, that there are two main types of respiration: aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration, correct? Aerobic respiration, it is a type of cellular respiration that takes place in the presence of oxygen to produce energy. Okay, and anaerobic respiration, it is a type of cellular respiration that takes place in the absence of oxygen to produce energy. Now in both the cases, energy is being produced, but the amount of energy that is produced in both the cases is different. So in aerobic respiration, oxygen is required, oxygen is involved, and in anaerobic respiration, oxygen is not involved. Now let us discuss a little more about respiration. What happens in respiration? Here the glucose, which is a 6-carbon compound, it is broken down into a 2 molecule of pyruvic acid, or you can say 2 molecules of pyruvate. So glucose being broken down into pyruvates or pyruvic acid. Okay, so this is a 6-carbon compound which breaks down into 3-carbon compound. So 2 molecules of pyruvate or pyruvic acid, each one is a 3-carbon compound. Now this process of glucose being breaking down into pyruvate or pyruvic acids, this process is called as glycolysis, and in this process 2 ATPs are released. Okay, so this process it takes place in the cytoplasm, and this first step, it is the common step for both aerobic as well as anaerobic respiration. And if we speak about glycolysis itself, it is an anaerobic respiration. Okay, so glucose being broken down into pyruvates, this itself is an anaerobic respiration. That means it takes place in the absence of oxygen. Okay, and this is the first common step for both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Now what happens to these 2 molecules of pyruvic acid? It depends in which organism or which cell the further reaction is being taking place. So if the reaction is taking place in the absence of oxygen, where the oxygen is not present, there can be either fermentation. What happens in fermentation? Now suppose the 2 pyruvic acid is reacting in an yeast cell. So there will be fermentation taking place where 2 molecules of ethanol or 2 molecules of ethyl alcohol will be produced. Okay, and in this process, when two molecules of pyruvic acid is being converted into two molecules of ethanol, there is carbon dioxide released. So this is what happens in the brewing industry. To produce alcoholic beverages, this is what happens, that 2 pyruvic acid, it reacts in the yeast cell to produce the ethanol or the ethyl alcohol. And if the 2 pyruvic acid are reacting in the muscle cell, okay, if it is reacting in the muscle cell, what will be produced? 2 lactic acids will be produced. Okay, so if it is happening in the yeast cell, ethanol will be produced, and if it is happening in the muscle cell, there will be lactic acid produced. Now when the ethanol is produced, your carbon dioxide is liberated, but when it happens in the muscle cell, there is no carbon dioxide formed over here. Okay, now in both the processes, be it fermentation for ethanol or lactic acid, in both these processes 2 ATPs are released. Okay, so in anaerobic respiration, that is when oxygen is not produced or not present, 2 ATPs are produced. Now normally when we speak about glucose giving us energy, we say that it gives 36 ATPs, correct? But that happens only in an aerobic process where the oxygen is present. So when the oxygen is present, 36 ATPs are given or 36 ATPs are produced. But in anaerobic case, only 2 ATPs are produced. Now let us further discuss about aerobic respiration. Now aerobic respiration, as the name says, that it is in the presence of oxygen, and we have already discussed previously that be it anaerobic or be it aerobic respiration, the first common step will be glycolysis. Okay, so glycolysis is the first common step. Now when we studied about glycolysis, we studied it in a very simple way, that glucose is broken down into pyruvates, or you can say 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. But this is not that simple. Glycolysis itself is a 10-step process. That means glucose being broken down into pyruvate, this is taken, this happens in a 10-step process. So this becomes the first step of aerobic respiration. The second step is Krebs cycle. So Krebs cycle, it takes place in the cytoplasm. It takes place in the mitochondria. Glycolysis, it takes place in the cytoplasm, whereas Krebs cycle, it takes place in the mitochondria. The third step is the electron transport chain, or you can say the ETC chain or ETC cycle. This takes place in the inner membrane of mitochondria. And the fourth step is oxidative phosphorylation, that takes place in the F1 F0 particle of mitochondria. Okay, so there are 4 steps that are involved in aerobic respiration. The very first step, that is glycolysis, it takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell, whereas the rest 3 stages or the 3 parts, it takes place in the different parts of mitochondria. Now students, let us study further about aerobic respiration, and we'll start by studying glycolysis in detail. Okay, glycolysis, as discussed previously, glycolysis itself is an anaerobic respiration. Okay, it takes place in the absence of oxygen. Now, what do you mean by glycolysis? Glyco, the word stands for glucose, whereas lysis means breaking down. So the whole process, what is happening is glucose is being broken down to form pyruvate or pyruvic acid. This whole step, it takes place in the cytoplasm. It is an anaerobic process, and this process of glycolysis, it is also known as EMP pathway. Why is it called as EMP pathway? It is called EMP pathway because the 3 initials E, M and P is being given by the name of the scientist who have given this process of glycolysis. Okay, so Emden, Meyerhoff and Parnas were the 3 scientists who gave this process of glycolysis. So that is how it is also called as EMP pathway. Now if we speak about the 10 steps of glycolysis, the first half of glycolysis, it is an energy investment process. Okay, so in the first half, the energy is being used up, the energy is being invested, and the second half is the energy giving process. So the second half, you can say, is the paying off process. The energy that is invested in the first half, it is being paid off in the second half. Okay, so that we'll understand when we are studying these 10 stages. So let us start with it. So we'll be starting with glucose getting converted into glucose 6 phosphate. Okay, so in the first step, you can see that energy is being used up. So glucose, when it gets converted into glucose 6 phosphate, to give this phosphate, what happens is ATP is broken down into ADP, and the enzyme that is involved in this process is hexokinase. The second process, what happens is glucose 6 phosphate is just changed, or it just interchanges into its own isomer. Okay, so it changes into glucose 6 phosphate will change into fructose 6 phosphate. Okay, and over here the enzyme that is involved is phosphoglucoisomerase, because it is just an isomer. Glucose 6 phosphate and fructose 6 phosphate are the two isomers of each other. Then there is one more phosphate added to it. Okay, in the next step, one more phosphate is added to it. So fructose 6 phosphate, you can see, is getting converted into fructose 1,6 biphosphate. So again one phosphate is being added. Where will this phosphate come from? So again one ATP is being converted into ADP. So again the energy is being used up over here. In the next process, in the fifth process, what happens is fructose 1,6 biphosphate, it splits into two compounds. It breaks into two compounds. The first compound is glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate, and the second compound is dihydroacetone phosphate. So both these compounds are 3 carbon compounds. So fructose 6 phosphate, this is a 6 carbon compound which is broken down into a 3 carbon compound of each glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate and dihydroacetone phosphate. Now both these compounds, they are isomers of each other. Okay, that means they can be converted into each other. Now the further steps that we'll see it with glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate. This can happen with dihydroacetone phosphate also. Okay, so at the end, when we see that with glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate a pyruvate is being made, similar process is being happening with dihydroxyacetone phosphate. Okay, so dihydroxyacetone phosphate gets converted into glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate, and the same process is being carried out. So now we'll see the process with glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate. So further, what happens? Glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate. Now over here, now let me also tell you that over here the investment process is over. Okay, so the first part, that is where the energy is being invested, is over. The second half starts from here, where the energy is being given, the investment is being paid off. So over here glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate, it oxidizes into 1,3 biphosphoglycerate. So aldehyde is getting oxidized into acid. Okay, and when there is because this is a redox reaction, something is getting oxidized, so something has to be reduced also. So what gets reduced over here? NAD, it gets reduced into NADH plus H plus ion, or you can also write it as NADH2. Okay, and in the same process, one inorganic phosphate is also given in. So there is one inorganic phosphate also that is added up to this part. Okay, now next, 1,3 biphosphoglycerate is converted into 3-phosphoglycerate. Okay, now again you can see that 2 ADP is getting converted into ATP. So there is addition, or you can say that the energy is given over here, and 1,3 biphosphate gets converted into 3-phosphoglycerate. Correct? And the enzyme that is involved over here is phosphoglycerokinase. Then the 3-phosphoglycerate gets converted into 2-phosphoglycerate. Again the same enzyme is involved, that is phosphoglyceromutase. Okay, so it is just a it is just getting converted. Okay, so 3-phosphoglycerate is getting converted into 2-phosphoglycerate. Then the 2-phosphoglycerate gets converted into PEP, that is phosphoenol pyruvate. And at this process, 2 molecules of water is being given out. Okay, and the enzyme that is involved in this process is enolase. Then finally this PEP or phosphoenol pyruvate, it gets converted into pyruvic acid, or you can say it gets converted into pyruvate. And the enzyme that is involved over here is pyruvate kinase. Okay, with this, the process of glycolysis, that is glucose being broken down into pyruvate or pyruvic acid, this is done. Okay, so as I said that we have seen the process with glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. The same process is being carried out with dihydroxyacetone phosphate, where dihydroxy or acetone phosphate, it first gets converted into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and then the same process is being carried out. Now students, after this, let us also study about the next cycle or the next part of aerobic respiration, that is the Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle that takes place in the mitochondria, it is named after the scientist. Okay, this Krebs cycle, it is also called as the TCA cycle, or the full form of this is tricarboxylic acid cycle. Okay, now the pyruvic acid that is being produced in the process of glycolysis, it participates in this Krebs cycle. And the pyruvic acid, by releasing carbon dioxide and NAD being reduced into NADH2, it gives acetyl coenzyme A. And this is from where the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle starts. So acetyl coenzyme A now gets converted into citric acid, or you can say it gets converted into citrate, which is again a 6 carbon compound. Okay, and this citric acid then further gets converted into its own isomer, that is isocitrate. And the enzyme that is involved in this process is citrate isomer. So in the second part over here, the enzyme that is involved is citrate isomer. Again, isocitrate gets converted into alpha ketoglutarate, and again there is a reduction that takes place over here, where NAD is being reduced into NADH plus and H plus ion, or you can also write it as NADH2. Okay, and also a carbon dioxide is released at this stage. Then the alpha ketoglutarate gets converted into succinyl. So succinyl coenzyme A. Now what happens at this process over here, when alpha ketoglutarate is converted into succinyl coenzyme A, there is a coenzyme that is added and oxygen is being liberated over here. Also there is a reduction that is taking place again, that is NAD being converted into NADH2. Okay, now this succinyl coenzyme A gets converted into succinate. Okay, and during this process two things happen. One, the coenzyme that was added up at the fourth step over here, it comes out. Okay, because when succinyl coenzyme A, it gets in the fifth step, when it gets converted into succinate, the coenzyme A, it gets removed. Okay, and the energy is released, and this energy is used to convert GDP to GTP. And this GDP to GTP, the conversion of GDP to GTP, it is then used to form ATP. Okay, now succinate, which was given up by the succinyl coenzyme A, in the sixth reaction succinate gets converted into fumarate. Okay, now over here also there is a reduction happening, but the reduction is happening with FAD. It is not happening with NAD, it is happening with FAD, where FAD is getting converted into FADH2. Fumarate is then getting converted into malate, where you can see there is an addition of water molecule as well. Then malate in the eighth step gets converted into oxaloacetate or oxaloacetic acid, again with a reduction of NAD to NADH2. Okay, and then oxaloacetic acid will again give rise to acetyl coenzyme A, and this cycle is being continued in the similar way. So this cycle, that is the Krebs cycle, it takes place in the mitochondria of the cell. Now students, we are ending this session over here. We have studied about glycolysis and we have studied about Krebs cycle. In the next part, we will be taking this chapter forward, where we will be studying about the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation.